What stopped Henry VIII from approaching his new wife? The unforgettable stench. The sentence lands like a knife in the quiet of the royal bedchamber, and for 4 centuries it has done the work of a legend. Sharp, swift, irreversible. Imagine the scene the rumour invites. Candles guttering against brocade, a king on the threshold hesitating, courtiers frozen in embarrassed anticipation, a whisper running through the room. She smells of rotten fish. It is an image that solves everything. It explains refusal without humiliating the monarch. It disposes of disappointment by blaming a woman. It wraps an awkward impotence in a story that is effortless to tell and almost impossible to disprove. But stories are not the same as facts. The claim that a sovereign in person recoiled because of an unspeakable odor is precisely the kind of rumor that thrives where politics and reputation mingle. Vivid, portable, and perfectly useful. When we pry open the history behind that single line, what emerges is not a tidy, sensory event, but a tangle of diplomacy, painting, pride, and medical uncertainty, and above all, an intentional reshaping of the record by those who needed an answer that did not implicate the king. England, in the closing months of 1539, was a country weathering isolation. Henry VIII had broken with Rome. He had severed ties that had once anchored his kingdom within a web of European power. Excommunicated and diplomatically circled, he faced threats on more than one side. He was a monarch who judged the world in alliances and marriages. A royal marriage was not romance so much as statecraft, a treaty written in flesh and ceremony. The choice of a spouse could mean new allies and the legitimacy of heirs, the latter being an obsession that had defined much of Henry's reign. Into that calculus stepped Thomas Cromwell. For Cromwell, the king's chief architect of policy and shaper of the Reformation state, a match with a German duchess seemed both prudent and modern. It would ally England with Protestant German princes. It would avoid picking a French bride and the political entanglements that would follow, and it would solidify a diplomatic pivot. England was not alone. It was a player. Cromwell imagined diplomacy that did not require armies, but paint and paper, portraits and letters and subtle arrangements negotiated across continental courts. Hans Holbein, the court painter famous for his precise and flattering likenesses, became an instrument of that diplomacy. To a monarch who had made decisions on looks before, think of the portraits that once whetted Henry's appetite for Anne Boleyn years earlier. The painted face could serve as a guarantor, a politically expedient substitute for a personal reconnaissance that the king's duties and the distance of geography made difficult. Holbein was dispatched to the continent not merely to make a likeness. He was tasked to produce an image that would move a throne. The result, by almost every contemporary account, was a portrait of Anne of Cleves that presented dignity, charm, and the kind of composed reserve suitable for a queen. It was a portrait that functioned as a political passport, a carefully composed document in pigment and shadow, communicating suitability in a single glance. That Holbein painted a woman who was not the king's immediate acquaintance, but a dynastic partner matters. In that painted face, Henry saw what he wanted to see: a partner, an ally, a potential mother of English heirs. What the painting did not, and could not, capture were the small, human, awkward exchanges that happen when two people meet, or the particular pressures of a king who was no longer young and whose body was becoming a public question. Anne of Cleves was not a foreign caricature. She was the daughter of a minor German prince, raised to comport herself with the reserve and formality that her station demanded. When she left the small courts of the Rhine for the tumult of the English court, she crossed not only sea and language, but a world of expectation. She arrived to a palace that was theatrical by design. Every gesture and greeting had a social cost. For Anne, who spoke little English and whose customs differed from the English court's more effusive habits, the ground was unfamiliar. She was expected to embody the dignity of her house and to navigate an environment where every perceived slight could be read as a political message. The first test came in a way that reads to us now, like something out of a drama. Henry, ever conscious of display and of his own sovereign spectacle, chose to visit Anne in disguise. Contemporary accounts, some recorded by observers sympathetic to different sides of court politics, say the king wished to see her unawares, to observe natural comportment rather than the stiff etiquette arranged for a new queen's public reception. What happened, and how it was interpreted, mattered more than the literal facts. Anne is said to have received the visitor with German reserve. She did not throw herself into familiar warmth or embrace the masked figure. She retained the etiquette she had learned. Polite, perhaps formal, not full of recognition for a stranger. From Henry's vantage, and through the lens of a monarch for whom praise and admiration were a kind of sovereign fuel, this reserve read as a personal affront. Whether she did not recognize him, or whether she simply maintained distance, the absence of the eager, intimate devotion Henry craved wounded him deeply. It was a bruise to royal masculinity, but it was also the exact kind of narrative a court bent on explaining royal behavior could magnify. This is important. The court at any time is a theatre, and reputations are often rewritten to cover the wounds of power. A monarch does not simply lose face in private. His public authority risks erosion if his private capacities appear to fail. The idea that a king might be humiliated by being overlooked in a disguised encounter was not trivial. For Henry, it fed a longer sequence of anxieties about image, sanctity, lineage, and, crucially, potency. We begin to see how the ingredients for the stench rumor were assembled. There was a portrait that promised more than the encounter delivered. There was a king whose vanity was easily wounded. There was a minister, Cromwell, whose political capital now rested on a marriage he had engineered. Add to that an environment in which a court eager for explanation could supply a story that spared the king and excused the match. Blame the bride. But before the blame could be cast, another factor pressed in: the king's body. By late 1539, Henry was not the mobile, athletic figure of his youth. The chroniclers, again not neutral observers but actors in their own right, recorded a sovereign slowed by weight, hampered by leg sores, in pain, and prone to mood swings. Ambassadorial dispatches, the bread and butter of early modern diplomatic history, offer a different kind of view from that of court chroniclers. Foreign envoys were professional observers who sent letters home reporting what they saw in sober prose, often with political bias, but also with a clarity born of distance. These dispatches, the kinds of documents historians rely on to piece together a less stage-managed view, emphasize Henry's physical decline. They speak of swollen legs, ulcers, infirmities that would have made long travel and athletic display difficult. They note a sovereign on whom time had pressed, whose health was fracturing in ways that modern scholars have tried to interpret. Medical historians today read these threads not as single diagnostic statements, but as patterns, a combination of obesity, chronic ulceration, perhaps infection, and metabolic changes that, together, can impair mobility and sexual function. Forensic reappraisals suggest possible complications: infections that sap energy, conditions that blunt libido, and maladies that complicate a man's ability to perform physically in a ceremonial context. We do not, and must not, speak of these as settled facts. The rule of scholarly caution applies. We say that evidence suggests, that modern analysis interprets, that a constellation of symptoms is consistent with certain diagnoses. But the pattern is clear enough to point historians in a direction that changes how we read the rest of the episode. If the king might have been medically compromised, and if consummation was expected to be a public juridical confirmation of the marriage's validity, then the stakes were not only personal, but constitutional. A royal wedding in the 16th century was, among other things, a legal and symbolic act. Consummation established the marriage in the eyes of canon and crown. Failure to consummate could be grounds for annulment. If the sovereign could not perform, then inconvenient possibilities opened up. The court needed a narrative that preserved the monarch's image, while allowing a graceful exit from an alliance that did not satisfy his private expectations. It was in this pressure cooker of image and necessity that the story of the smell could be born. Thomas Cromwell, for all his intelligence and daring, was not immune to the politics of blame. He had arranged the match, a success on paper, and a failure at court could be read as his failure. The court's gossiping tongues and the chroniclers' pens were hungry for a culprit. It is not hard to imagine the political calculus. Better to pin error on the bride, a foreigner whose voice and reputation could be controlled from a distance, than to allow the king's virility to become a subject of public inquiry. In a world that equated masculine potency with sovereign legitimacy, any talk of impotence was dangerous to the state as much as to the man. There is power in a rumor that can't be easily disproved. Smell, as a charge, is particularly suited to propaganda. It is immediate and intimate, but also ephemeral and subjective. No official could produce a certificate of odor. To accuse a woman of a repulsive scent was to wound her dignity without offering her a ready remedy. The tale of the unforgettable stench could be repeated in private chambers and among foreign courts, and then set down by chroniclers who favored a narrative in which the king's instincts were unimpeachable and the minister's judgment suspect. The rumor, once launched, gained momentum because it did a crucial bit of political work. It preserved the king's honor. Anne of Cleves found herself at the center of a storm, not of her making. She had come to England expecting, by most accounts, a dignified accommodation as queen. She could not have known she would be cast as scapegoat for a domestic failure she neither caused nor could have foreseen. Contemporary sources that later repeated the smell story, names like Edward Hall or, much later, David Hume, did so in ways that reflected their own aims and the narratives they were comfortable endorsing. Hall, writing within a generation of the events, shaped his chronicle with the tastes of his day. Later historians, sometimes repeating what they had read rather than investigating the sources anew, allowed the anecdote to ossify into fact. But there are other less sensational documents that complicate the tidy legend. Ambassadorial correspondence, reports from English posts and from the continent, preserves a texture of observation that points elsewhere. These dispatches describe Henry's infirmities with a clinical detachment that does not lend itself to the kind of comic cruelty the smell story implies. They note his swollen limbs, his difficulty with movement, the ulcers that pained him, and the pall of melancholy that sometimes settled on his court. When historians line up these dispatches against the anecdotes from court gossip and the later retellings that made the stench into folklore, a different picture emerges. One in which the king's body, not a bride's hygiene, explains at least part of what happened. We must also consider the role of Holbein's portrait more carefully. The painting was not merely flattering, it was an instrument of expectation. Henry bought an image, literally and politically. When the original encounter did not match the painted promise, he recoiled, not just at a person, but at the betrayal of an image he had allowed himself to trust. What the portrait did was reduce a living woman to a surface that could be consumed at a distance. When the surface failed to satisfy the king's intimate need, the only available public remedy was to produce a narrative that reattached blame to the woman herself. Now, calendar and ceremony begin to sharpen. The Rochester episode, the disguised visit that left Henry feeling slighted, took place in the narrow window between Anne's arrival and the royal marriage. The wedding itself was scheduled for January 6, 1540, a date chosen with the symbolic care Henry favored. Royal protocol demanded that the marriage be consummated, and that consummation would serve as the final seal. If on that night the king found himself unable to fulfill what was expected of him, the problem was not private. It had legal and political consequences. Consider the implications. If a sovereign could not consummate his marriage, opponents and opportunists could leverage that fact. An annulment could be sought. On what grounds, and by whom? The law of marriage and consummation mixed the private and the political so tightly that a physical failure took on public meaning. For Cromwell, who had staked his reputation on a successful alliance engineered through negotiation and portraiture, the possibility of annulment posed a dire threat. He needed a plausible explanation that did not lead back to the king. At the time, the medical establishment surrounding Henry, surgeons and physicians like Dr. William Butts, who served the royal household, were part of the apparatus that could frame the story. Their observations mattered because they could push the interpretation towards sickness or towards another cause. But physicians worked within court politics as well. Loyalty to the sovereign was not merely personal, but institutional. Any medical explanation that undid the king's dignity was politically risky. So the court's narratives moved in directions that were convenient. We are now at a threshold where the elements of a scandal are fully arrayed: a flattering portrait, a king wounded in pride and perhaps body, a minister whose career depends on the marriage, a foreign bride who can be spoken for from afar, and a communicative world, chroniclers, courtiers, ambassadors, who will tell the tale in ways that confirm preferred versions. The invention of a bodily odor as the cause of rejection is an act of rhetorical displacement. It sends the cause outward, places culpability on the woman, and spares the sovereign the kind of scrutiny that might destabilize more than his personal reputation. It is worth pausing on Anne herself. Far from the caricature of a grotesque bride doomed by her own stench, the archival trail reveals a woman who would later, after the annulment, accept terms that ensured her survival in the English court. She did not go back to Cleves and vanish. She negotiated a settlement, received a house and a pension, and lived in relative dignity among the English nobility. That settlement was not an admission of personal failings. It was, in fact, an agreement that protected her and preserved the peace. Her later life complicates any simple moralistic reading of the saga. She was neither monstrous nor feeble. She was a political actor within the narrow options her situation afforded, and yet the smell story stuck. Why? Because it fit a deeper, older pattern, the gendered weaponization of sexuality. Accusing a woman of odor was a way of stripping her of respectability without producing evidence that contradicted a man's sovereignty. It invested bodily humiliation with the force of public law. The charge required no witnesses beyond those willing to repeat it. It required no forensic proof. It was an accusation conveniently timed to close a narrative gap. By the winter of 1540, the stage was set. Henry had married Anne on January 6th. The wedding was real enough, bodies and vows included, yet the substance of the marriage remained to be proven. The king's private doubts, his physical condition, the court's hunger for an explanation, and Cromwell's political exposure all pointed toward a crisis. What happened in the rooms where crown and flesh met would determine not only the fate of a minister and a foreign duchess, but the way history would remember the episode. There is, in sources that survive, a moment of acute tension. Some contemporaries would later paint the king as recoiling from a smell. Others, the more sober dispatches, record a sovereign whose leg was sore, whose energy was limited. The narrative diverges. One path goes toward a scandal of odor, the other toward a story of infirmity. Which path a court chooses is not decided purely by fact, but by the needs of power. And so we arrive at the night itself. The ceremonial intimacy of a royal bedroom, the choreography of attendants and witnesses charged with certifying what the sovereign could not or would not admit publicly. The bedchamber in a Tudor palace was never solely a place of private affection. It was a stage of constitutional significance. The king's body was a political body. Its failures were public risks that required narrative repair. What we can say, with archival certainty, is that the marriage did not long survive its initial promise. By July of 1540, Parliament had annulled the union, and Anne received a settlement that secured her status and her incomes. In the months between January and July, however, the calculus of blame shifted and turned. Ministerial fortunes rose and fell. Thomas Cromwell, who had seemed unstoppable as the architect of the alliance, found himself vulnerable, arrested in June, and executed on July 28, 1540. The swift fall of a man who had engineered a match now read like the consequence of having misled the king, the sort of scapegoating the stench rumor made tidy. But the legal and ceremonial record, the annulment papers, the pension rolls, the household accounts that record Anne's lodging and incomes, provide a quieter set of facts. They tell us that Anne did not simply vanish in disgrace. Instead, she was given dignity in the terms arranged by the Crown. She remained in England, and by surviving into favour, complicated the tidy cruelty of the smear. At the same time, in the dust of rumours and the public record, a historiographical question takes shape. How did a story so ugly gain a life so long? Why did historians and chroniclers keep repeating a line that served partisan purposes? The answer lies in the work of narrative. An anecdote that explains, that entertains, and that absolves is more likely to be retold than a complex set of circumstances that implicate powerful actors. The smell story was effective propaganda because it answered a political anxiety with a tidy, gendered insult. Modern historians, working with ambassadorial dispatches, archival accounts, Holbein's portraits, and the legal record of annulment and pension, have begun to reconstruct a more complicated truth. Forensic reappraisals do not produce dramatic corrections, so much as layered interpretations, that Henry's body was failing, that consummation was, for reasons likely connected to that decline, impaired, and that the court manufactured an explanation that preserved royal dignity. When scholars point to the surgeon's notes and diplomatic letters that emphasize ulcers and infirmity, they are not simply contradicting legend. They are reminding us that human bodies do not always perform in the ways political ritual demands. We stop here, at the threshold between ceremony and consequence, because the next steps are where rumor hardens into history. In the rooms beyond the bedchamber door, decisions were made, some medical, some political, and many rhetorical. The invention of an odor as the cause of failure was not an accident. It was a choice. The choice tells us how power behaves when there is something to hide. It tells us how reputations are manufactured and how a woman like Anne of Cleves can become an enduring scapegoat for a king's private collapse. What follows is the test. Will the record allow us to separate the useful story from the true one? Can we, with the steady hand of archival method and the caution of medical inference, undo a narrative that did the work of protecting power? The answer will take us deeper into the correspondence of ambassadors, into the pages of the annulment, and into the household accounts that record a duchess who was paid to live in England. It will make us confront how gossip, art, medicine and law interlocked to produce a story that wore the sheen of truth for 400 years. If you want to keep unraveling what actually happened that winter in Greenwich, the rooms where portrait and person met, the testimonies that were shaped and repeated, and the political choices that made a scandal out of a sovereign's failing body, stay with this investigation. The documents, the portraits and the dispatches offer a different kind of evidence than the anecdote. Together, they will let us see how a myth is made and why correcting it matters, not merely for the sake of accuracy, but for the dignity of the person on whom history's cruelty settled. If you want to keep unraveling what actually happened that winter in Greenwich, to follow the paper trail behind the gossip, to peer into the letters that diplomats wrote home and the accounts that household clerks kept, then we must move from the image to the archives. The sensational line about a stench was convenient. The documentary record that survives is less theatrical and in many ways more damning of those who told the tale than of the woman it was told about. Begin with the provenance of the accusation. The smell story does not appear as a single neat report from a neutral witness. It creeps into the record through gossip, then through chroniclers with axes to grind, and finally through writers who found the anecdote too tidy not to repeat. Early biographers and popular chroniclers liked an explanation that cleared the king while assigning blame elsewhere. For audiences hungry for drama, an Odor is a perfect villain, unverifiable, intimate, and humiliating. But when historians lay out the primary sources, ambassadorial dispatches, court accounts, surgeons' notes, the portrait itself, a different sequence of causes becomes visible. Take the dispatches. Foreign envoys, whose livelihoods depended on accuracy and who often reported home in tedious, painstaking detail, recorded the king's decline in ways that don't fit the comic cruelty of the Stench anecdote. The imperial ambassador, writing to his court, dwelt on Henry's swollen legs and recurring sores. Others noted a sovereign less able to pace the day, prone to pain and irritable moods. These are not gossip. They are observations made by professional eyes with reasons to report honestly. Where a court chronicler might spin a story to flatter or to scorn a minister, an ambassador's letter reads like the work of someone who had to justify analysis to distant patrons. When those dispatches are placed beside the rumors, the weight of evidence tips toward a king who was physically compromised. We should also look closely at the Rochester visit. Small, staged moments that can balloon into political crises. The disguised approach, undertaken by Henry, was not a mere comic trick. It was a ritual test in which the monarch sought affirmation he could not reliably summon by ordinary parley. What Henry expected, perhaps hoped for, was the kind of spontaneous affection that the portrait had promised him. What he encountered instead was the reserved hospitality of a German noblewoman accustomed to formal reception. In the psychology of the court, reserve could be read as contempt. For a sovereign accustomed to flattery and theatrical submission, the absence of adulation felt like rejection. That slight, amplified by rumor, is the ember that would kindle a fire of explanation. Now place yourself within the bedchamber. The wedding night was not simply a drama of two bodies and candlelight. It was a legal ritual with constitutional ramifications. Consummation sealed the marriage in canon and precedent. When a sovereign's body could not perform this legalized intimacy, the problem could not quietly be filed away. The question of who or what had failed became an urgent political problem. Did the marriage fail because the bride was somehow unsuited, or because the king was physically incapable? The court had a powerful incentive to prefer explanations that preserved monarchical prestige. Consider the medicine of the time. Surgical and physician notes in the royal household and the reports those men made to courtiers suggest a king struggling with chronic conditions. Infections in the leg, described contemporaneously as ulcers, were recurring and painful. Sustained obesity was well documented by observers who remarked on Henry's bulk and reduced mobility. Modern forensic historians, careful to avoid categorical diagnosis, read these symptoms together and conclude that they are consistent with conditions that would impair stamina, wound healing, and sexual function. Scholars note that chronic infection and metabolic disease can blunt libido and make consummation physically difficult or impossible. Again, these are interpretations, not definitive medical pronouncements. But they are plausible in light of the sources. Munificent as the medical scholarly framing is, politics still demanded a story that kept the king blameless. The malleable nature of smell made it useful. No physician's certificate could disprove an accusation of odor. It was a public-friendly, private-seeming slur, intimate enough to wound, vague enough to be impossible to refute. Once courtiers and chroniclers picked up that line, it circulated quickly. The smell story was easy to pass on because it did precisely what the court needed. It placed culpability on the Duchess and shielded the sovereign's reputation. That rhetorical choice allowed the political machinery to keep functioning while the personal and constitutional anxieties it disguised were quietly resolved. How did that machinery work? It operated on several levels at once. The king's advisers, ministers, physicians, attendants were aware of the stakes. Thomas Cromwell, who had engineered the alliance and whose rise was tied to the marriage, had everything to lose if the union failed publicly. If the blame for a bad match could be pinned on the foreign bride, Cromwell's policy looked like a miscalculation rather than an affront to the sovereign. If, instead, the king's body were exposed as the problem, those adverse political consequences could ripple outward. Heirs, succession, the credibility of Henry's religious and diplomatic choices. The court therefore had a motive to generate an external culprit. Once the smell narrative existed, it gathered voices. Chroniclers who wrote within a generation or two, a cast of men who worked the same political field, repeated the anecdote in ways that fused entertainment and judgment. Later historians, writing from a comfortable distance, sometimes accepted that repetition uncritically, and so a rumor hardened into legend. The consequence was a story that carried moral outrage and comic derision in equal measure. The king, humiliated by a bride who smelled, the minister, exposed by his failure, the foreign woman, reduced to an object of scorn. None of these outcomes captured the real work happening inside the royal household: negotiation, legal argument, and the quiet arranging of an exit that would look like a mutual parting rather than a confession of sovereign infirmity. That exit took formal shape in the months that followed the January wedding. The marriage, celebrated on January 6, 1540, proved short-lived in legal terms. The annulment was processed in the summer. Parliament and the Royal Council acted to declare the union void in July 1540. In the interim, the pressure on Cromwell intensified. He was arrested in June, detained amid accusations and political maneuvering that found him culpable for having recommended the match, and was executed on July 28, 1540. Cromwell's precipitous fall is the clearest political casualty of the episode. The minister who had turned a continental marriage into an instrument of statecraft now found himself the scapegoat for an outcome that threatened the king's dignity. Anne's fate was different, and it illuminates how power can produce both cruelty and magnanimity, depending on what serves the crown. Rather than exile or execution, Anne negotiated terms that protected her. The crown provided her with a settlement, lands and income sufficient for a comfortable household, a residence in England, and a role within the royal circle that preserved rank without the burdens of queenship. She was given a status, often characterized in the records as the king's sister rather than his wife, that allowed her to remain in dignity at the English court. That settlement, codified in legal records and household accounts, demonstrates that Henry and his advisers preferred to neutralize the situation with prudent largesse rather than public disgrace. For Anne, the agreement was survival and security, not vindication of the slander. Anne's later life complicates the tidy moral of the smell story. In the years after the annulment, she remained on friendly terms with the court, attended royal functions, and was granted residences where she entertained and lived with considerable comfort. She outlived several of Henry's queens and survived into the reigns of his children. When she died in 1557, she was buried in Westminster, an outcome that belies a life defined by victimization. Such an ending does not erase the slander that followed her, but it does reveal the limits of the court's cruelty. They could disenfranchise her claim to an English crown, but they could not entirely destroy her status when it suited political order to preserve it. We must ask, then, why the smell story persisted, even as Anne's life quietly contradicted it. The answer returns us to the nature of storytelling. Anecdotes that confirm expectations tend to be preferred over evidence that complicates. A single sentence, "She smelled of rotten fish," fit a narrative shape that absolved powerful men. It was easy to repeat, vivid in social memory, and adaptable to the tastes of playwrights, pamphleteers, and historians alike. An archive full of dry dispatches, invoices, and legal documents is harder to dramatize. It requires patience, not punchlines. So the smear lived on because it was serviceable and piquant, and because succeeding generations of writers trafficked in stories rather than in paperwork. In recent decades, historians have taken that paperwork seriously. Archival work in the 20th and 21st centuries, deep dives into foreign dispatches, household accounts, physicians' journals, and the parliamentary record, has allowed scholars to place the anecdote into a broader evidence-based frame. Forensic historical methods, which combine medical knowledge with textual analysis, show how the constellation of Henry's ailments could plausibly account for the events previously attributed to a bride's alleged odor. Scholars emphasize the recorded ulcers, the fluctuating health described by ambassadors, and the ways in which chronic pain can alter sexual response. They do not claim to prove, with modern diagnostic certainty, that the king was physiologically impotent. Rather, they argue that the totality of the evidence makes it much more likely that his body, not Anne's hygiene, was the decisive factor. Equally important, archival work reveals the channels by which the slander was amplified. The same dispatches that record Henry's infirmities also reveal the political conversations in which a smell allegation would be useful. Household accounts and pension rolls show how Anne was treated materially after the annulment, generously enough to demonstrate a pragmatic impulse towards settlement. Parliamentary records mark the legal end of the marriage in July 1540. The sequence of events: Rochester in early January, marriage on January 6th, political unraveling in the spring, Cromwell's arrest in June, and execution on July 28th, and the annulment in July, reads as a political drama in which rumor and calculation move together. Modern historians, by arranging the documentary evidence, have reconstructed a credible narrative that pushes the stench anecdote into the realm of political expedient rather than factual cause. There is an ethical dimension to this reappraisal. We live with a responsibility to correct reputations when the record allows. Anne of Cleves was, in the long run, a survivor of Tudor politics. She navigated a foreign court, negotiated a settlement, and remained a figure of standing until her death. The persistence of a slander that reduced her to a grotesque punchline has been a small cruelty repeated across centuries. Rescuing her image is not merely an act of historical fairness. It is an exercise in understanding how power protects itself by manufacturing scapegoats. The episode also teaches a broader lesson about the relationship between bodily decline and political storytelling. Rulers are public figures whose private bodies often become political texts. When those bodies fail to conform to expectations of vigor, fertility, majesty, the social machinery that depends on those expectations rearranges events to maintain the fiction of competence. The Stench story is a paradigmatic example, a rumor that functioned to displace impotence onto a woman, thereby preserving the image of sovereign potency at the cost of her reputation. Power, too, is opportunistic in its cruelty. Thomas Cromwell's career, after all, demonstrates how quickly proximity to power can become dangerous when outcomes disappoint. His architectural role in matching England with the Cleves alliance tied him to its success. When success faltered, he became expendable. The machinery that protected the king's image had to find a fall guy, and the narrative of a repugnant bride provided a swift scapegoat. Cromwell's fall, arrest in June, and execution on July 28, 1540, was in part the political accounting for that scapegoating. Yet the archival record complicates the story in another way. It shows that the Crown settlement with Anne was not mere charity, but a political calculation. Keeping her in England and treating her with respect avoided the spectacle of a discarded foreign duchess wandering back to the continent with a scandal in her wake. It prevented diplomatic complications with her family and preserved stability at home. This pragmatic generosity suggests that the court's motives were not solely malevolent. They were also governed by the cold arithmetic of statecraft. That duality, the simultaneous cruelty of a smear and the measured protection of a pension, illustrates how power can both wound and repair when expedient. What then should remain with us from this winter's story? First, a caution about easy explanations. The unforgettable stench is a tidy anecdote that answers questions faster than archives can. But tidy answers do not always mirror messy reality. Second, a recognition of how historically contingent reputations are. They can be made and remade by political needs, and it takes patient archival labor to undo them. Third, an ethical insistence that the objects of slander, often women and other vulnerable figures, deserve careful reconsideration when the evidence permits. Anne of Cleves did not die anonymously or in penury. She lived out her days in relative comfort, kept the king's favour in a second, less intimate register, and was granted burial at Westminster when she died in 1557. Those facts sit uneasily alongside a rumour that made her infamous. The truth, as the archives suggest, is less salacious and more humane. She became an instrument in the political management of an uncomfortable truth about a king's body and a state's image. As historians and observers, we have a duty to interrogate the stories that come most easily to hand, to ask who gains from a rumour, who repeats it uncritically, and what archival evidence is available to either confirm or refute it. The case of Henry and Anne shows us how quickly a court can manufacture explanation, how power uses gendered tropes to contain embarrassment, and how myths can calcify into common knowledge across generations. If there is a final image to carry from this episode, let it be one that restores dignity. Picture Anne not as a grotesque caricature invented by rumour, but as a politically adroit woman who negotiated the sharp currents of a foreign court, maintained her position, and refused to be annihilated by the slanders of others. Picture also a state apparatus that preferred plausible tales to uncomfortable truths, an apparatus that chose, for reasons of image and order, to make a scapegoat of an inconvenient woman, rather than to lay bare the sovereign's own infirmities. Power will always look for ways to defend itself. Our work, as readers of the past, is to pry open their explanations and to watch how stories are made, repeated, and eventually questioned. The unforgettable stench that fueled 4 centuries of gossip may have made for entertaining copy. But when we follow the letters, the medical reports, the portraits, and the legal records, a different, clearer, and far less sensational truth appears. The incident was less an olfactory catastrophe than a political expedient designed to preserve royal dignity. If this investigation has shifted your view of that infamous line, consider how many other easy stories deserve the same archival scrutiny. Share this video with someone who loves history with nuance, and write in the comments, which historical slander should we unravel next?